September 9, 2000. The emergency dispatcher in Wichita, Kansas received a call at 4:17 a.m. The voice on the other end was shaking, nearly incomprehensible through the panic. A man was reporting an unthinkable tragedy. His wife, a prominent local optometrist, had been shot. She wasn't breathing. He needed help immediately. Within minutes, emergency responders were racing through the dark streets toward an upscale neighborhood in northeast Wichita. The address was 3808 North Kingsborough Court, a beautiful two-story home in one of the city's most desirable areas. When paramedics burst through the door, they found Dr. Lynette Phillips lying on the bedroom floor. The 42-year-old woman was wearing her nightgown, and there was blood, so much blood, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Her husband, Dr. Michael Phillips, stood nearby in a state of apparent shock. The paramedics worked frantically, but even as they tried to save her, they knew Dr. Lynette Phillips was dead. Michael told the first responders his story between gasping breaths. He had been startled awake by a sound. When he opened his eyes, he saw a figure standing in their bedroom doorway. An intruder. The figure raised a gun. Michael lunged forward, trying to protect his wife. A shot rang out, and then the intruder fled. It was a home invasion, he said, a random act of violence. His beloved wife had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as the sun rose over Wichita that morning, detectives arriving at the scene began to notice things. Small details that didn't quite fit Michael's story. Questions that needed answers. And the more they looked, the more they realized that nothing about this case was random at all. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Dr. Lynette Phillips was. Born Lynette Montgomery, she had built an impressive life through hard work and determination. After earning her doctorate in optometry, she established a thriving practice in Wichita. Her patients loved her. Her colleagues respected her. She had married Michael Phillips in 1984, and for 16 years they had appeared to be the ideal couple. Michael was a dentist with his own successful practice. They lived in a beautiful home, drove nice cars, took vacations to exotic locations. They had 2 children who were thriving in school. To their friends and neighbors, the Phillips family represented the American dream. Professional success, financial security, a loving marriage. They were active in their church, involved in the community, always ready with a smile. But as investigators began digging into the Phillips lives, a different picture started to emerge. One that their carefully maintained public image had concealed for years. Lynette's friends and family revealed that the marriage had been troubled for some time. There had been arguments, separations, talk of divorce. Michael, they said, had a temper that he carefully controlled in public but unleashed behind closed doors. More troubling were the financial records that detectives uncovered. Despite their successful practices, the Phillips were drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out, loans in default, the beautiful home mortgaged beyond its value. And then investigators discovered something that made them look at Michael Phillips with renewed suspicion. Just months before Lynette's death, Michael had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife, a policy that would pay him $1 million if she died. The pieces were starting to come together, but detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. They needed to understand exactly what had happened in that bedroom. They needed to prove that Dr. Michael Phillips had murdered his wife. Detective Ken Landwehr stood in the Phillips master bedroom, studying every detail with the practiced eye of a veteran investigator. He had worked hundreds of crime scenes over his career, and something about this one felt staged. The first red flag was the lack of any signs of forced entry. No broken windows.
No damaged doors.
No scratches on the locks. If an intruder had entered the house, they had either picked the locks expertly or had been let in. Michael claimed he had locked all the doors before going to bed. He was certain of it. He always checked them before sleeping. So how had this mysterious intruder gotten inside? The second issue was the position of Lynette's body. Michael said he had lunged at the intruder, trying to protect his wife. But Lynette's body was lying on the floor in a way that suggested she had been standing when she was shot, not lying in bed. The blood spatter patterns supported this. She had been upright, facing her killer. And then there was the matter of the bullet trajectory. The forensics team determined that the shot had been fired from close range at a slightly downward angle. Not the angle you would expect if someone was firing from a doorway while Michael lunged at them. More like the angle of someone standing directly over the victim. But the most damning evidence was what wasn't there. There was no sign of a struggle in the room beyond the shooting itself.
No overturned furniture.
No defensive wounds on Lynette's hands. No indication that she had tried to fight off her attacker. It was as if she had been caught completely by surprise. As if the last person she expected to hurt her had pulled the trigger. Detective Landwehr conducted his initial interview with Michael Phillips that very day. Michael was cooperative, almost eager to help. He described the intruder as a shadowy figure, possibly male, possibly wearing dark clothing. He couldn't provide many details because everything had happened so fast. When asked why an intruder would target their home, Michael suggested a burglary gone wrong. But nothing had been taken. Not the jewelry on Lynette's dresser. Not the cash in Michael's wallet. Not the expensive electronics visible throughout the house. What kind of burglar shoots someone and then flees without taking anything? Detective Landwehr thanked Michael for his time and told him they would be in touch. As he drove away from the Phillips home that afternoon, he was already certain of one thing. This was no random home invasion. This was murder. And Dr. Michael Phillips was his prime suspect. As detectives dug deeper into Michael Phillips' life, they uncovered a secret he had been desperately trying to hide. There was another woman. Her name was Susan Teal, and she had been Michael's patient at his dental practice. The affair had begun approximately 2 years before Lynette's death. Susan was divorced with children of her own. According to friends, she had been swept off her feet by the charming, successful dentist. He told her his marriage was over in all but name. He said he and Lynette were staying together only for the children. He promised that once the time was right, he would leave his wife and they could be together. But months turned into years, and Michael made no moves toward divorce. Susan grew impatient. She wanted a real relationship, not secret meetings and hidden phone calls. She gave Michael an ultimatum: leave Lynette or lose her. Phone records obtained by investigators showed extensive contact between Michael and Susan in the weeks leading up to Lynette's death. Late-night calls, text messages. They painted a picture of a man torn between two lives, desperately trying to figure a way out of his predicament. But there was a problem. Michael couldn't afford a divorce. The debt situation was so severe that if he and Lynette split their assets, both would face bankruptcy. His dental practice would be at risk. His reputation in the community would be destroyed. More importantly, he would lose Susan. She had made it clear she wasn't interested in being with a broke, disgraced dentist. She wanted the successful, established man she thought she had fallen in love with. The life insurance policy provided an answer to all of Michael's problems. $1 million. More than enough to pay off the debts, keep his practice afloat, and start fresh with Susan. All he needed was for Lynette to die. When investigators interviewed Susan Teal, she was shocked. She insisted she had known nothing about any plans to harm Lynette. Yes, she had been having an affair with Michael. Yes, she had pressured him to leave his wife. But murder? She would never have condoned that. Detectives weren't sure whether to believe her. Had Susan been an unwitting motivation for murder, or had she played a more active role? One thing was certain. Her relationship with Michael Phillips had created a motive as old as time itself. A man who wanted to be free of his marriage without losing everything in a divorce. But wanting someone dead and actually killing them are two very different things. Detectives still needed to prove that Michael Phillips had pulled the trigger. 3 days after Lynette's death, Detective Landwehr brought Michael Phillips in for a formal interview. This time, it wasn't a courtesy conversation at his home. This was an interrogation at the police station, recorded on video for the jury that Landwehr hoped would eventually see it. Michael arrived with his attorney, but he waived his right to have the lawyer present during questioning. He wanted to help, he said. He wanted to find the person who had killed his wife. For the first hour, Michael stuck to his story. An intruder had entered their bedroom. He had tried to protect Lynette. The intruder had shot her and fled. He was devastated by what had happened. But Detective Landwehr was patient. He had been trained in interrogation techniques that could break even the most composed suspects. He started by building rapport, expressing sympathy for Michael's loss. Then he began introducing inconsistencies. The lack of forced entry. How did the intruder get in? Michael suggested perhaps he had forgotten to lock a door, or maybe the intruder had picked the lock. The trajectory of the bullet. The forensics didn't match Michael's description of lunging at the intruder. Michael became defensive. The experts must be wrong. It had happened so fast. Maybe he was misremembering some details. Then Landwehr brought up Susan Teal. Michael's face paled. He hadn't expected them to know about her. At first, Michael denied the affair. Then, when confronted with phone records, he admitted it but insisted it was meaningless. Just a mistake. He had been planning to end it. Really? Because Susan told detectives Michael had promised to leave his wife. Michael's story began to shift. His voice grew more agitated. His body language changed. The calm, cooperative widower was being replaced by a cornered man. Landwehr then revealed the life insurance policy. $1 million, taken out just months ago. That was just good financial planning, Michael insisted. Every responsible husband has life insurance on his spouse. But why increase it so dramatically right when your marriage was failing and you were involved with another woman? Michael called for his lawyer. The interview was over. As Michael Phillips walked out of the police station, Detective Landwehr reviewed the recording. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. The inconsistencies, the lies about the affair, the panic in Michael's eyes when confronted with evidence. Now they just needed to prove he had actually pulled the trigger. The forensics team worked methodically to build their case. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every trace of evidence could be the piece that proved Michael Phillips had murdered his wife. The gun used to kill Lynette was never found. Michael claimed the intruder must have taken it when he fled. But investigators searched every inch of the property and the surrounding area. Nothing. Gunshot residue tests conducted on Michael's hands that morning came back negative. But that didn't necessarily mean anything. He could have washed his hands. GSR can be easily removed. More interesting was what the forensics team found on Michael's clothing. Despite his claim that he had lunged at the intruder and been close to Lynette when she was shot, there was no blood spatter on his pajamas. None on his hands. None on his arms. How was that possible? If he had been as close to Lynette as he claimed when she was shot at point-blank range, he should have been covered in her blood. The only explanation was that he hadn't been close to her at all when she was shot. He had been standing several feet away, perhaps even the person holding the gun. The crime scene reconstruction specialists created a detailed computer model of the shooting. Based on the blood spatter, the bullet trajectory, and the position of Lynette's body, they determined the most likely scenario. Lynette had been standing in the bedroom when she was shot. The shooter had been approximately 6 feet away, standing roughly where Michael claimed to have been sleeping. The gun had been fired at a downward angle, consistent with someone slightly taller than Lynette. Michael Phillips was exactly 6 feet tall. The reconstruction showed that Michael's version of events was physically impossible. There was no intruder in the doorway. There was no heroic lunge to protect his wife. There was only Michael Phillips standing with a gun, shooting his wife in their bedroom at 4 in the morning. But a jury would need more than forensic reconstruction. They would need a witness, someone who could place Michael Phillips with a gun, someone who could testify to his plans. Detective Landwehr continued investigating, convinced that somewhere in Michael's life, there was a person who knew the truth. Before we continue with this investigation, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Are you following this case during your morning commute, late at night, or somewhere in between? Drop a comment and let me know. It's fascinating to connect with listeners from around the world as we uncover the truth together. 6 weeks after Lynette's death, Detective Landwehr received a call that would break the case wide open. A woman named Jennifer Miller wanted to talk. She had information about Michael Phillips, information that she had been too scared to share until now. Jennifer had been a dental hygienist at Michael's practice several years earlier. She had left the job after a disturbing conversation with her boss, a conversation she had tried to forget, but that now seemed terrifyingly relevant. In Landwehr's office, Jennifer told her story. It had been during a particularly stressful period at the practice. Michael had been distracted, irritable, snapping at staff. One day, Jennifer had asked if everything was okay. Michael had looked at her with an expression she would never forget. Cold, calculating, and he had said something that made her blood run cold. He told Jennifer that he had been thinking about ways to solve his problems. Financial problems, marriage problems. He said he had looked into various options, but they all seemed too risky or too expensive. Then he asked Jennifer a question. If she wanted to get rid of someone, how would she do it? Make it look like an accident? A robbery gone wrong? Jennifer had been so shocked she hadn't known what to say. She had nervously laughed it off, treating it as a dark joke. But Michael hadn't laughed. He had just stared at her, as if genuinely waiting for an answer. The conversation had ended there, and Jennifer had tried to put it out of her mind. Maybe he was just stressed. Maybe he was joking in poor taste. She convinced herself it was nothing. But when she heard about Lynette's death, shot during an alleged home invasion, Jennifer knew she had to come forward. Michael hadn't been joking. He had been planning. Detective Landwehr immediately brought Michael back in for questioning. This time, Michael refused to answer any questions without his attorney present. He was no longer the cooperative, grieving husband. He knew the walls were closing in. But Jennifer's testimony, while compelling, still wasn't enough. It was hearsay from years ago. A good defense attorney would tear it apart. They needed more, and then they got it from the most unexpected source imaginable. Mark Phillips had always looked up to his older brother Michael. Growing up, Michael had been the golden child, smart, successful, admired by everyone. Mark had followed him into dentistry, establishing his own practice in a nearby town. But in the weeks following Lynette's death, Mark began to have doubts. He had visited Michael several times, offering support, helping with the children. And something about Michael's behavior disturbed him. Michael didn't seem grief-stricken. He seemed relieved, almost happy. He talked about plans for the future, about changes he wanted to make. He mentioned Susan Teal far more than seemed appropriate for a man who had just lost his wife. Then, during one visit, Michael had too much to drink. His guard dropped, and he told Mark something that would haunt him forever. They had been sitting in Michael's living room, late at night. Michael had been rambling about how difficult his life had been, how trapped he had felt, how Lynette had been controlling and demanding. Then he said, "You know, Mark, sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation is to do something impossible." Mark had asked what he meant. Michael had smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "I mean that sometimes life gives you problems that require permanent solutions." Mark had felt sick. He had tried to tell himself he was misinterpreting. But the implication was clear. There was more. Michael had asked Mark about the life insurance money. When would it come through? How long did these things usually take? He seemed impatient, eager to collect. That's when Mark realized the truth. His brother had killed Lynette, murdered her in cold blood for money and freedom. Torn between family loyalty and justice, Mark struggled for weeks. But finally, he called Detective Landwehr. He couldn't protect a murderer, even if that murderer was his own brother. Mark agreed to wear a wire. He would visit Michael and try to get him to say something incriminating. It was risky. Michael was smart, careful, but it was their best shot at getting a confession. The meeting was set for November 15th, 2000, 2 months after Lynette's death. Mark Phillips would be wearing a recording device, and police would be listening nearby. If Michael confessed, even partially, they would finally have enough to arrest him. Mark Phillips was terrified as he drove to his brother's house on November 15th. The small recording device taped to his chest felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He kept rehearsing what he would say, how he would steer the conversation toward Lynette's death without being obvious. Detective Landwehr and his team were parked a block away, listening through headphones. They had coached Mark on techniques to get someone talking. Express understanding. Don't judge. Make it clear you're on their side. The door opened, and Michael greeted his brother warmly. They settled in the living room with drinks. For the first hour, they talked about safe topics. The dental practice, the kids, sports. Then Mark carefully brought up Lynette. He mentioned how difficult it must be, being alone now. Michael's response was telling. He didn't talk about missing her. He talked about how much easier his life was without her constant demands. Mark pushed a little further. He said he had been thinking about what Michael had said during their last conversation. About doing the impossible when life becomes impossible. Michael grew quiet. Then he asked Mark what he meant. Mark took a breath. He said he wanted Michael to know that he understood. That sometimes people are pushed to extremes. That he wouldn't judge him no matter what. The room fell silent for what felt like an eternity. In the surveillance van, Detective Landwehr held his breath. Finally, Michael spoke. He said that Lynette's death had been unfortunate but necessary. He said he had been backed into a corner with no other options. He mentioned the debt, the failing marriage, Susan's ultimatum. But he stopped short of an explicit confession. He never said the words, "I killed her." He spoke in abstractions and implications. Mark tried to press for more details, but Michael seemed to sense something was wrong. He changed the subject abruptly and suggested they call it a night. As Mark left, his heart was pounding. He had gotten Michael to say damaging things, but would it be enough? Back at the station, Detective Landwehr and the prosecutor reviewed the recording. It was good evidence, but still not a slam dunk. Michael had been careful even when his guard was down. But combined with everything else, the forensics, Jennifer's testimony, the life insurance, the affair, they believed they had enough for an arrest. On November 20th, 2000, exactly 72 days after Lynette's death, police arrested Dr. Michael Phillips and charged him with first-degree murder. Michael Phillips was arrested at his home, in front of his children. Neighbors watched in shock as police cars surrounded the house and officers led the respected dentist away in handcuffs. The arrest made headlines throughout Kansas. Dr. Michael Phillips, successful dentist, pillar of the community, devoted father, was accused of murdering his wife for insurance money and another woman. Michael's attorney held a press conference proclaiming his innocence. This was a rush to judgment, they claimed. The police had tunnel vision and were ignoring other possibilities. Michael Phillips was a grieving widower being persecuted because investigators couldn't find the real killer. But behind the scenes, the evidence against Michael was mounting. Prosecutors were building a case that would paint a picture of a calculating, cold-blooded killer who had planned his wife's murder down to the smallest detail. The grand jury indicted Michael on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances. If convicted, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that the case was entirely circumstantial. No murder weapon, no witnesses to the actual shooting,
No confession.
just a lot of suspicion and innuendo. They had a point. Circumstantial cases are difficult to win. Prosecutors would need to weave together dozens of pieces of evidence into a narrative so compelling that a jury would have no reasonable doubt about Michael's guilt. As Michael sat in jail awaiting trial, his practice collapsed. Patients fled. His reputation was destroyed. The life he had built over decades evaporated in a matter of weeks. Susan Teal stopped taking his calls. The woman he had allegedly killed for wanted nothing to do with him now. The trial was set for March 2001, 6 months after Lynette's death. It would be one of the highest-profile murder trials in Wichita history. Lynette's family prepared to face the man they had once called family. Her parents, her siblings, her friends, all would sit in that courtroom and watch as the prosecution tried to prove that Michael Phillips had murdered the woman he had promised to love and cherish. The children, caught in the middle of this nightmare, were placed with Lynette's parents. They would have to grow up knowing that their father was accused of killing their mother. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared their strategies. The prosecution would present their web of circumstantial evidence, trying to show that while no single piece proved guilt beyond a doubt, together they painted an irrefutable picture of murder. The defense would attack each piece individually, creating doubt wherever possible. They would present an alternative theory, that an unknown intruder had indeed killed Lynette, and that Michael Phillips was being railroaded by overzealous investigators. It would be up to 12 ordinary citizens to decide who was telling the truth. The trial of Michael Phillips began on March 5, 2001. The courtroom was packed with media, spectators, and Lynette's grieving family. Michael sat at the defense table in a suit, looking more like a successful professional than an accused murderer. The prosecutor, Sarah Mitchell, stood to deliver her opening statement. She was a veteran with a reputation for winning difficult cases. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Mitchell walked the jury through the night of September 9, 2000. She described the 911 call, the crime scene, the body of Dr. Lynette Phillips lying dead on her bedroom floor. Then she began to dismantle Michael's story piece by piece. The lack of forced entry, the missing gun that was never found, the blood spatter evidence that contradicted his account, the gunshot residue tests, the forensic reconstruction showing his story was physically impossible. She talked about motive, the affair with Susan Teal, the crushing debt, the $1 million life insurance policy, the ultimatum from a mistress who wanted him to choose. Mitchell told the jury about Jennifer Miller's testimony, the disturbing conversation years earlier where Michael had essentially asked how to get away with murder. She described Mark Phillips' recorded conversation with his brother, where Michael had admitted Lynette's death was necessary. By the time Mitchell finished, she had woven all these threads into a tapestry of guilt. Michael Phillips, she argued, was a man who had made a calculated decision to murder his wife rather than face bankruptcy, divorce, and public humiliation. The defense attorney, Robert Carlson, had a different story to tell. He acknowledged that the case looked bad for Michael. Yes, there was an affair. Yes, there was debt. Yes, there was life insurance. But none of that proved Michael had pulled the trigger. Everything the prosecutor had presented was circumstantial. There was no murder weapon.
No witnesses. No confession.
Carlson argued that the police had focused on Michael from day one and ignored other possibilities. He suggested that the real killer was still out there, someone who had entered the Phillips home that night with the intention to rob or harm. He attacked the forensic evidence, suggesting that crime scene reconstruction was more art than science. He questioned whether Jennifer Miller's testimony from years earlier was even admissible. Most importantly, he argued that Mark Phillips' recording was a brother trying to trap his grieving sibling into saying something that could be twisted into a confession. Carlson told the jury they had to put aside sympathy for the victim and focus only on the evidence. And the evidence, he insisted, was not enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. As the opening statements concluded, it was clear this would be a battle between two competing narratives. The jury would have to decide which version of events was more believable. The prosecution called its first witness, and the trial began in earnest. Dr. Rebecca Chen took the stand as the prosecution's first major witness. As the medical examiner who had performed Lynette's autopsy, her testimony would be crucial in establishing the facts of the murder. Dr. Chen described the single gunshot wound to Lynette's chest. The bullet had entered just below her left clavicle, traveled through her lung, and lodged near her spine. Death would have been relatively quick, though not instantaneous. Based on the wound characteristics, Dr. Chen determined the gun had been fired from approximately 5 to 7 feet away. This contradicted Michael's story of lunging at an intruder in the doorway. If that had happened, the shot would have been fired from much farther away or at a different angle. The angle of the bullet's path was particularly damning. It had traveled slightly downward, suggesting the shooter had been roughly the same height as or slightly taller than Lynette, who was 5 feet 6 inches tall. Most importantly, Dr. Chen testified about what the wound pattern told her about Lynette's position when she was shot. The victim had been standing upright, facing her killer, not lying in bed asleep, not turning away, standing and facing the person who shot her. This suggested Lynette had known her killer. She hadn't been surprised by an intruder bursting into the room. She had been standing there, perhaps arguing with someone, perhaps pleading, when that person pulled the trigger. The defense tried to challenge Dr. Chen's testimony. Couldn't the bullet angle be explained other ways? Wasn't it possible Lynette had been moving when she was shot? Dr. Chen held firm. The forensic evidence was clear. Her killer had been standing directly in front of her, approximately 6 feet away, when the fatal shot was fired. The jury took notes. Several looked over at Michael Phillips, as if trying to picture him standing with a gun pointed at his wife. The prosecution's strategy was working. They were building a foundation of physical evidence that contradicted Michael's version of events at every turn. Detective Sarah Wong had been one of the first investigators at the Phillips home that morning. Now, months later, she sat in the witness stand with crime scene photographs and diagrams, ready to walk the jury through every detail. Wong described the master bedroom as she had found it. The bed was rumpled but not dramatically disturbed. A lamp on the nightstand was still standing. The door to the hallway was open. Everything suggested a scene that had been interrupted rather than one of violent struggle. Most tellingly, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Wong had personally checked every door and window. All were locked from the inside except the front door, which Michael said he had unlocked to let the paramedics in. The prosecution displayed photographs of the bedroom door frame. There were no tool marks, no damage, nothing to suggest someone had picked the lock or forced their way in. Wong testified about the blood spatter evidence. The patterns on the wall and floor indicated that Lynette had been standing when she was shot. The spray pattern was consistent with a gunshot wound to the torso from several feet away. Critically, there was no blood spatter on the bed where Michael claimed to have been sleeping. If he had been lying there when Lynette was shot just a few feet away, he should have been covered in blood. But his pajamas had been nearly clean. The defense cross-examined Wong aggressively. They suggested she had been biased against Michael from the beginning. They questioned whether she had adequately investigated the possibility of an intruder. Wong remained calm and professional. She explained that investigators always consider all possibilities. But the physical evidence simply didn't support the intruder theory. When asked directly if she believed Michael Phillips had killed his wife, Wong looked at the jury and said clearly, "The evidence speaks for itself. Everything at that scene pointed to one conclusion. There was no intruder. The killer was already in the house." The courtroom was silent as the weight of her words settled over the jury. The prosecution called Dr. James Morton, one of the nation's leading experts in crime scene reconstruction. He had analyzed thousands of cases over his 30-year career, and he had spent weeks studying every detail of Lynette Phillips' murder. Using computer models and detailed diagrams, Dr. Morton walked the jury through his reconstruction of the shooting. He showed how the blood spatter, bullet trajectory, and body position all told a consistent story. Lynette had been standing approximately in the center of the room, wearing her nightgown. The shooter had been standing near where the bed was positioned, roughly 6 feet away. The gun, based on the wound characteristics, was likely a .38 caliber revolver. The shooter had raised the gun and fired once. The bullet struck Lynette in the chest. She collapsed to the floor where paramedics would find her 20 minutes later. Dr. Morton then demonstrated why Michael's story was impossible. Using a mannequin and measurements from the actual bedroom, he showed that if an intruder had been standing in the doorway and Michael had lunged from the bed, the bullet could not have traveled at the angle it did. Furthermore, if such a struggle had occurred, there would have been evidence. Knocked over furniture, defensive wounds on Michael, signs of a physical altercation, but there was nothing. The only conclusion that fit all the physical evidence was that Michael Phillips had been the one holding the gun. He had been standing near the bed. Lynette had been standing a few feet away. He had shot her once in the chest and then called 911. The defense brought in their own expert to challenge Morton's conclusions. Dr. Richard Hayes argued that crime scene reconstruction was an inexact science. There could be other explanations for the evidence. The police had been too quick to dismiss the intruder theory, but under cross-examination, Dr. Hayes admitted he hadn't visited the actual crime scene. He had only reviewed photographs and reports. Dr. Morton, by contrast, had spent hours in the Phillips bedroom, taking measurements, analyzing angles, testing theories. The jury seemed more convinced by Morton's meticulous approach than by Hayes' general skepticism. As the forensic testimony concluded, the prosecution had established a clear picture. The physical evidence proved Michael Phillips' story was a lie. Susan Teal was the witness everyone had been waiting for. The other woman, the alleged reason Michael Phillips had decided to kill his wife rather than face divorce. Susan walked to the witness stand looking uncomfortable. She had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. The prosecutors didn't believe she had been involved in planning the murder, but they needed her to establish Michael's motive. Susan described meeting Michael when she came to his dental practice as a patient. He had been charming, attentive, professional. When he asked her out for coffee, she had been flattered. The affair began slowly. Coffee dates became dinners. Dinners became something more. Michael told her his marriage was essentially over. He and Lynette were staying together only for the children and for financial reasons. Susan testified that she had believed him. He seemed genuinely unhappy at home. He talked about eventually leaving Lynette once the circumstances were right. But months passed, then a year, then 2 years. Michael made no moves toward divorce. When Susan confronted him, he always had excuses. The timing wasn't right. The debt situation needed to be resolved first. The children weren't ready. Finally, in the summer of 2000, Susan gave Michael an ultimatum. She told him she wanted a real relationship or nothing at all. She was tired of being the secret, the side piece, the one he only saw when it was convenient. Michael had seemed panicked by this demand. He promised he would figure something out. He asked for time. He said he was working on a solution. Susan testified that she had no idea what he meant by that. She certainly never imagined he was planning to murder Lynette. The prosecution asked Susan about phone calls in the weeks before Lynette's death. Records showed dozens of calls between them, sometimes late at night, sometimes lasting hours. What were those conversations about? Susan said Michael had been talking about his future. Their future. He seemed to be planning something, though he was vague about details. He talked about money coming through that would solve all his problems. Looking back, Susan realized with horror what he had meant. But at the time, she had assumed he was talking about a loan or a business deal. The defense attacked Susan's credibility. They suggested she was testifying to save herself from prosecution. They pointed out that her immunity deal gave her every reason to lie. But Susan's emotions seemed genuine. She appeared devastated by the realization that she had been the motive for murder. Whatever her relationship with Michael had been, she clearly hadn't wanted Lynette dead. As Susan left the witness stand, several jurors looked at Michael with obvious disgust. The man who had promised to love and cherish his wife had been plotting her murder while conducting an affair. If you're still with me at this point in the trial, I'd love to know. Where are you listening from and what time is it there? This case gets more complex with each piece of evidence. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're following along with the truth about Dr. Michael Phillips. The prosecution called Sandra Torres, a forensic accountant who had spent 3 months analyzing the Phillips family finances. Her testimony would establish the second major motive for murder: money. Torres walked the jury through a financial picture that was far bleaker than anyone outside the family had known. Michael and Lynette's combined income was substantial, over $300,000 per year, but their spending had exceeded their income for years. Credit card debt totaled nearly $85,000. They had taken out a second mortgage on their home. Michael's dental practice was leveraged to the maximum. Collection agencies were calling regularly. If they had divorced, both would have faced bankruptcy. Michael's dental practice, his source of income and professional identity, would likely have been sold to satisfy debts. He would have lost everything he had spent his career building. But Torres' most damaging testimony concerned the life insurance policy. In March 2000, just 6 months before Lynette's death, Michael had increased her life insurance from $200,000 to $1.2 million. The insurance agent testified that Michael had been insistent about the increase. He said he wanted to make sure his family would be taken care of if anything happened to Lynette. But the timing was suspicious. Why suddenly increase the policy when your marriage was failing and your finances were in ruins? Torres calculated that the insurance payout would be more than enough to pay off all the Phillips debts with substantial money left over. Michael would emerge from his financial crisis not just solvent but wealthy. The defense argued that responsible people carry life insurance on their spouses. Increasing coverage wasn't evidence of murder, it was evidence of financial planning. But the prosecutor pointed out that Michael had only increased Lynette's policy, not his own. If he was truly concerned about family protection, wouldn't he have increased both policies? The insurance company had already denied Michael's claim, citing the murder charge. If convicted, he would never see a penny of the money. The scheme had failed. Torres' testimony established what investigators had suspected from the beginning. Michael Phillips was drowning in debt and saw his wife's death as the only way out. The courtroom was packed when Mark Phillips was called to testify. A brother testifying against his brother in a murder trial was rare and dramatic. Everyone wanted to hear what Mark had to say. Mark looked uncomfortable as he took the oath. He avoided looking at Michael, who sat staring at him with an unreadable expression. Mark testified about growing up with Michael, the successful older brother he had always admired. He described how shocked he had been when he heard about Lynette's death. Then he talked about the visits after the murder, how Michael's behavior had struck him as odd, how he had seemed more relieved than grieving. Mark described the conversation where Michael had talked about doing the impossible and finding permanent solutions to his problems. The implications had been clear, even if Michael hadn't explicitly confessed. The prosecutor played the recording from Mark's visit in November. The jury heard Michael's voice, slightly slurred from drinking, talking about how Lynette's death had been necessary, even though Michael never said, "I killed her." The context was damning. He talked about being trapped, about having no other options, about how much better his life was now. Mark's voice broke as he testified. He said he had struggled with the decision to wear a wire and trap his own brother, but ultimately he couldn't protect someone who had committed murder. The defense cross-examination was brutal. They accused Mark of betraying his brother for attention. They suggested he had misinterpreted innocent comments as admissions of guilt. They pointed out that the recording didn't contain an explicit confession. Michael had never said he killed Lynette. He had just made vague comments that could be interpreted many ways. Mark held firm. He knew what his brother had meant, and he knew that protecting a murderer would have made him complicit in the crime. As Mark left the stand, he finally looked at Michael. The two brothers locked eyes for a long moment. Michael's expression was one of pure hatred. That moment would be captured in photographs and would run in newspapers across Kansas. Two brothers, torn apart by murder. After 3 weeks of prosecution testimony, it was the defense's turn to present their case. Robert Carlson stood before the jury with a simple message. The prosecution had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Everything they had presented was circumstantial. Yes, Michael had been having an affair. Yes, there was debt. Yes, there was life insurance. But none of that proved he had pulled the trigger. The defense called their own witnesses, neighbors who testified that the Phillips neighborhood had experienced several burglaries in the months before Lynette's death. Maybe an intruder had been targeting their home. A locksmith who explained how easy it would be to pick the locks on the Phillips doors. An intruder wouldn't necessarily need to force entry. A psychologist who testified about how trauma can affect memory. Michael's confused recollection of events that night could be explained by shock, not by lying. But the defense's strongest argument was the absence of certain evidence. There was no murder weapon.
No confession.
No witnesses who saw Michael pull the trigger. The prosecution had built a compelling narrative, but it was still just a story. Without direct evidence, how could the jury be certain? Carlson hammered this point repeatedly. In America, we don't convict people based on suspicion or motive. We convict them based on proof. And the prosecution's proof had too many gaps. Michael Phillips chose not to testify. His attorneys advised that putting him on the stand would expose him to cross-examination that could be devastating. Better to let the prosecution's case stand with all its supposed weaknesses. But his refusal to testify struck many observers as suspicious. If he was truly innocent, why not take the stand and tell his side of the story? Why not look the jury in the eye and swear he didn't kill his wife? The defense rested after just 1 week of testimony. They had decided that trying to do too much would only highlight the strength of the prosecution's case. Better to keep it simple. Not enough evidence, reasonable doubt remains. Now it was time for closing arguments, where both sides would make their final appeals to the jury. Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell stood before the jury for the final time. She had spent weeks building her case brick by brick. Now it was time to bring it all together. She walked the jurors through the evidence systematically. The affair with Susan Teal that gave Michael motive. The crushing debt that made divorce impossible. The life insurance policy that made murder profitable. The forensic evidence that proved Michael's story was a lie. The blood spatter, the bullet trajectory, the lack of any signs of an intruder. All of it pointed to one conclusion. Mitchell played the recording of Michael talking to his brother. She reminded the jury of Jennifer Miller's testimony about Michael asking how to get away with murder. She addressed the defense's argument about circumstantial evidence. Yes, each piece alone might create doubt. But together, they formed an unbreakable chain. Michael Phillips had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to kill his wife. And all the physical evidence showed he had done exactly that. Mitchell's voice rose with passion as she concluded. Dr. Lynette Phillips had been a successful optometrist, a mother, a daughter, a friend. She had gone to bed on September 9, 2000, never imagining that the man lying beside her was planning her murder. Michael Phillips had taken her life for money and another woman. He had destroyed his children's mother. And now the jury had the power to hold him accountable. The defense's closing was more subdued. Robert Carlson acknowledged the tragedy of Lynette's death. But he reminded the jury that feeling sympathy for the victim couldn't override the requirement for proof. He went through the prosecution's evidence point by point, creating doubt wherever possible. The forensics were debatable. The financial situation could be explained other ways. The affair was wrong but not illegal. Most importantly, there was no murder weapon, no confession, no direct evidence. Everything was interpretation and assumption. Carlson urged the jury to remember their oath. They had sworn to convict only if the prosecution proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He argued they had not met that burden. As both attorneys sat down, the case went to the jury. 12 ordinary citizens would now decide whether Michael Phillips was a murderer or a wrongly accused widower. The deliberations began on March 28, 2001. The jury would have to reach a unanimous verdict. The wait began. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. Lynette's family sat in the courthouse, praying for justice. Michael's few remaining supporters hoped for an acquittal. On March 31st, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Michael was brought in, his face pale but composed. Lynette's parents sat in the front row holding hands. The judge entered and the jury filed in. No one could read their expressions. Were they looking at Michael? Avoiding him? It was impossible to tell. The foreman stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. Yes, Your Honor. In the case of the state of Kansas versus Michael Phillips, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? The courtroom held its breath. We find the defendant guilty. Lynette's mother let out a sob. Her father closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Behind them, friends and family embraced, crying with relief. Michael showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead as if he hadn't heard the words that had just sealed his fate. The jury had also found him guilty of premeditated murder with special circumstances, which carried an enhanced sentence. The judge thanked them for their service and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. As Michael was led away in handcuffs, he finally looked at Lynette's family. His expression was unreadable. Anger? Regret? Resignation? No one could say. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor held a brief press conference. She thanked the jury for their careful consideration. She said that while nothing could bring Lynette back, at least her family had justice. Detective Landwehr was asked if he had ever doubted they would get a conviction. He admitted there had been moments of concern. Circumstantial cases are always risky. But he had believed in the strength of the evidence and in the jury's ability to see the truth. Lynette's father read a statement on behalf of the family. He said that Lynette had been a wonderful person who had trusted the wrong man. He thanked the investigators, the prosecutors, and everyone who had worked to bring her killer to justice. On May 15, 2001, Michael Phillips returned to court for sentencing. The judge had discretion to impose anywhere from 25 years to life without parole. Several of Lynette's family members spoke at the sentencing hearing. They described the woman they had loved and lost. They talked about the hole her death had left in their lives. They spoke about her children growing up without their mother. Michael was given the opportunity to speak. He stood, and for the first time since the trial began, he addressed the court. He maintained his innocence. He said he had loved Lynette and would never have harmed her. He insisted he was the victim of a flawed investigation and circumstantial evidence. The judge was unmoved. He noted the overwhelming evidence of guilt. He spoke about the breach of trust. A husband murdering his wife in their own bedroom. He called the crime particularly heinous because of the planning and premeditation involved. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Phillips would die in prison. He would never again be a free man. Michael Phillips did not accept his conviction quietly. From prison, he launched a series of appeals that would stretch on for years. He claimed his trial had been unfair, that evidence had been improperly admitted, that his attorneys had been ineffective. The Kansas Court of Appeals reviewed his case in 2003. They examined every aspect of the trial, looking for errors that might have affected the verdict. They found none. The conviction was affirmed. Michael appealed to the Kansas Supreme Court. Again, his conviction was upheld. The court found that the evidence had been overwhelming and that the trial had been conducted properly. He filed federal habeas corpus petitions, claiming his constitutional rights had been violated. Federal courts also denied his appeals. With each failed appeal, Michael's chances of ever leaving prison grew smaller. His legal options were running out. Meanwhile, his children were growing up. They had been placed with Lynette's parents after Michael's arrest. They struggled with the knowledge that their father had killed their mother. Therapy helped, but the trauma would affect them for the rest of their lives. Lynette's optometry practice had been sold after her death. Her patients remembered her fondly. A scholarship in her name was established at the optometry school she had attended. Susan Teal, the other woman, moved away from Wichita. She changed her name and tried to build a new life away from the infamy of the case. She never spoke publicly about Michael again. Michael's dental practice was dissolved. His professional license was revoked. Everything he had built over his career was gone. The $1 million life insurance policy was never paid. The insurance company had successfully argued that Michael should not profit from his crime. The money eventually went to Lynette's estate for the benefit of her children. Detective Landwehr retired from the Wichita Police Department in 2009. The Phillips case was one of the most challenging of his career. He said that despite the difficulties, he had never doubted they had the right man. Jennifer Miller, the dental hygienist who had testified about Michael's disturbing questions, said she was glad she had come forward. It had been frightening to testify, but she felt she owed it to Lynette. Mark Phillips, Michael's brother, eventually moved out of state. The betrayal, both Michael's of Lynette and Mark's of Michael, had torn the family apart. Mark said he still sometimes wondered if there had been another way, but he knew he had done the right thing. The case became a subject of study in criminology courses. It was featured in true crime documentaries and podcasts. The story of Dr. Michael Phillips and his calculated murder of his wife became a cautionary tale about greed, betrayal, and the ultimate price of infidelity. But for Lynette's family, it was never just a story. It was their lived reality. The permanent absence of someone they loved. The knowledge that she had been killed by the person who was supposed to protect her. As I bring this story to a close, I want to hear from you one final time. Where in the world are you? And what time did you finish listening to the case of Dr. Lynette Phillips? This has been a long journey through a complex investigation. Drop a comment below with your location and thoughts on this case. And if you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more true crime investigations. Today, more than 2 decades after that September morning in 2000, Michael Phillips remains in prison. He is now in his mid-60s, serving his life sentence at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. According to prison records, he has been a model prisoner. He works in the prison library and has taken correspondence courses, but he has never admitted guilt. He maintains to anyone who will listen that he is innocent, wrongly convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Lynette's children are now adults. They have built lives for themselves despite the trauma of their childhood. They rarely speak publicly about their parents or the case. They deserve privacy and peace. The case of Dr. Lynette Phillips stands as a reminder that evil can hide behind a respectable facade. Michael Phillips was a successful dentist, a community member, someone you might sit next to at church and never suspect of being capable of murder. But beneath that facade was a man willing to kill his wife rather than face the consequences of his choices. A man who valued money and his mistress more than the life of the woman who had stood beside him for 16 years. The investigation was a triumph of patient, methodical police work. Detective Landwehr and his team had built their case piece by piece, overcoming the challenge of a crime with no witnesses and no murder weapon. The forensic evidence had been crucial. The blood spatter analysis, the bullet trajectory, the crime scene reconstruction, all of it had combined to prove that Michael's story was impossible. But perhaps most powerful had been the testimony of those who knew him. Jennifer Miller's disturbing conversation. Mark Phillips' painful decision to betray his brother. Susan Teal's admission about the affair. Together, they had painted a picture of a man capable of murder. The case also highlighted the importance of circumstantial evidence in modern prosecutions. While there was no smoking gun, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence had been overwhelming. The jury had understood that proof doesn't always come in the form of direct evidence. For criminal justice professionals, the Phillips case is studied as an example of how to build a successful circumstantial case, how to connect motive, means, and opportunity, how to use forensics to contradict a suspect's story, how to present complex evidence in a way a jury can understand. But for most people, it's simply a tragic story. A woman who trusted the wrong person, a man who chose murder over divorce, children who lost their mother to their father's greed and cowardice. Dr. Lynette Phillips went to bed on September 8, 2000, never knowing that her life had just hours left. She had worked hard to build her career, raise her children, maintain her marriage. She deserved to grow old, to see her children marry, to enjoy retirement. Instead, she died at 42, killed by the man who had promised to love her until death did them part. He had kept that promise, but not in the way anyone imagined. The rain continues to fall over Wichita, Kansas. Life goes on. The house at 3808 North Kingsborough Court has new owners now, people with no connection to the tragedy that occurred there. But Lynette's memory lives on, in the hearts of those who loved her, in the scholarship that bears her name, in the patience she helped over her career, in the justice that was finally served. And Michael Phillips will spend the rest of his days in prison, paying for the crime he committed. The freedom he killed for will forever remain out of reach. The new life he imagined with Susan will never come to pass. The insurance money will never be his. He traded everything for nothing. And in doing so, he destroyed not just Lynette's life but his own. This is the legacy of Dr. Michael Phillips. Not a successful dentist or a respected professional, but a murderer who thought he could get away with the perfect crime and learned, too late, that there is no such thing. Some truths can be buried, but they can never be buried deep enough. Eventually, they rise to the surface. Eventually, justice finds its way. Dr. Lynette Phillips received that justice. May she rest in peace.